Well, how many of you are familiar with the story of the parting of the Red Sea? Probably every one of us, right? As we look at that story sometimes, though, I think we see, I don't know about you, but whenever I look at this story, you see God's power in saving the Israelite people out of the bondage in Egypt. But I kind of feel bad for the Egyptians in the fact that they were just following what their leader had told them to do, knowing that they're paying the penalty for someone else's bad decision as they enter into the sea and they're destroyed. But on the other hand, God had been gracious to them for over 400 years and allowing them the opportunity to repent, but yet they didn't do it. So in light of that, sometimes we forget the fact that they were due the punishment of their sin. But on the other hand, we know that God is gracious and kind, and He was to His people. But He also promised the Israelite people ahead of time that He was going to bring judgment on Egypt. And so we look at that and we kind of have this, what's going on? You know, you got a gracious, loving God, but you also have a God who judges, and that's just the reality of who God is, isn't it? In our culture, we don't understand necessarily all that, but especially this day and time, no one's held accountable for their actions and their sins. So we struggle with that mindset, but the reality is God is swift in His judgment, and He chooses to be gracious on who He chooses to be gracious on. And so as we look at this story, the one thing we need to understand is God is all-powerful, and He's the one true God, and His actions are always just and right, even if we don't understand them. But we're going to find out today how God wants us to trust Him as we move on in life and as we face challenges in our life that we have no control over and no power to solve. God is our only help, and He's our only hope, and if we trust Him, He'll see us through. Especially in those times when we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, we really struggle to understand what's going on. We know God is faithful, and we need to trust Him because He promises to always be with us, doesn't He? He says He'll never leave us nor forsake us. So as we get into this lesson, this is one we're familiar with, but I want us to see new details in this. But the key doctrine in this lesson is God is all-powerful, and we're going to see that. As we've already seen in the book of Exodus, God has promised the Israelites. He sent Moses and Aaron into Egypt to talk to Pharaoh, and after the last plague of the firstborn child, they had the Passover. Now they're actually heading out to the Sea of Galilee. The Red Sea. I'm getting locations confused. They're going to the Red Sea and getting ready to cross over. But what's amazing about this is Pharaoh said, yes, we'll do it, but then as soon as he let the people go, he turned around and changed his mind. And that was part of God hardening his heart. And God's promise was that He would make Himself known. His glory would be revealed. So in this lesson today, God is going to demonstrate His power, but He's also going to demonstrate His grace. And one thing that we need to see in this is any time that we're in opposition to God, there's going to be judgment. Because the Egyptians were in opposition to God and they faced the wrath of God. As Christians today, we're also going to see the picture of God's salvation in this lesson. Because God saved the people of Egypt out of bondage, and ultimately we're also in bondage in sin until we've trusted Christ as our Savior. So we can see that parallel here. And so as we get into this lesson, I want us to understand that God is faithful and He'll use any means possible to fulfill His purpose. And He's done that in this lesson. And so as you have your Bibles open or your books, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 14, beginning in verse 13 and 14. So it says, "But Moses said to the people, 'Don't be afraid, stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet.'" Now, this is while the Israelites are standing right at the edge of the Red Sea. They've camped there, and the Egyptians have then decided to chase them down and to conquer them, and God has put a wall up between them. We're going to see that here in a minute. So they're camped at the edge of the Red Sea, and they're kind of trapped between the Egyptian army and the Red Sea. They have nowhere to go. And that's their situation right now. And God speaks to Moses. And then Moses tells the people, don't be afraid. And listen to what he says. He says, stand firm. That word there just means unmovable. Be unmovable. Plant your feet where you're at and just stand still. He says, and see the Lord's salvation. I want you to catch something there. It didn't say, and see our salvation. That's not what Moses said, is it? He's pointing to the fact that God is the one who's giving them victory here. That's going to give them the help that they need. He says, stand still and see the Lord's salvation, or stand firm and see the Lord's salvation, that He will accomplish. You notice that. Not that He might accomplish or that He could accomplish. He says that He will. You see, because God's actions didn't depend on the Israelites' actions here at all. God had already had a plan to fulfill His promise to them in spite of what they might do. And we see an obedient Moses here doing what God says. He says that He will accomplish for you today. You notice that. Moses said, it's going to happen today, guys. Now, stand still. It's not about you doing it. You can't do nothing to fix your problem. You got Egypt here and you got the Red Sea here. You have nowhere to go. So stand still and see what God's going to do for you today. He says, for the Egyptians you see today you'll never see again. The Lord will fight for you and you must be quiet. These two verses right here give us the reality of life for us too. When we're facing a challenge that we have no control over, have no power over, we need to stand still and watch and see what God's going to do. Because when we get our feathers ruffled and we get all excited and jump into things trying to fix our own problem, we end up getting deeper and deeper in trouble. There's just sometimes in life that there's insurmountable things in our lives that we can't do anything about, and we have to just stop and seek God's help and stand still and wait till He moves. No one likes to do that, especially in our day and time. We want things right now. I want to go to Walmart and buy whatever it is I want right now. I don't want to wait to have to order it online, because I can't stand that personally. I can't stand buying something online and worrying that it's going to not work right, and then have to turn around and ship it back and go through all this. We want it right now. That's just the culture we live in. And especially when we're in a difficult situation we don't want to be in. I mean, if you're trapped underneath a car and you can't get out, you want out right now. You don't want to lay there for 2-3 hours waiting on the ambulance service to come and get you, right? You want it right now. And that's kind of where they're at. They're in the midst of death, ultimately. That's all they saw. They saw, well, we're going to drown in the sea, or we're going to be killed by the Egyptians. And so Moses, at the very beginning, says, stand still, stand firm, stay where you're at, just watch and see what God does. That's hard to do, though. How many of us have been through difficult times and we had the confidence just say, I'm just going to stand still and wait to see what God does? We don't do that very often, do we? We get anxious, we get antsy, and we don't want to wait. We want it now. But Moses reminds the people that they're not in charge. God is. And he made the statement, today God's going to do something about it. So you don't have to wait much longer. It's going to happen soon. So he gave them a timetable, but then he said in verse 15, the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to break camp. As for you, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. The author said here, he said, the people saw only Pharaoh's army, but God, whom they could not see, was with them and would save them. Moses here obviously was crying out to God, and God just says, hold on, Moses. What are you doing? He says, why are you crying out to me? tell the Israelites to break camp, and as for you, lift up your staff, spread it over the Red Sea, and part the waters so that they can go through on dry ground. You know, even Moses, a faithful servant of God, sometimes he got caught up in the midst of the struggle too, because he's human, just like we are. I don't know about you, but especially if you're leading thousands and thousands of people, you're going to get a little anxious, especially when everyone's whining and carrying on, crying to you, so what are we going to do? And they're all in a tizzy, I'm sure. And Moses kind of starts crying out to God, and so God says, Moses, quit crying out to me and lift up your staff and do what you need to do. And so to me, it seems like Moses should have already known that, but I don't know. God just makes it very clear to him, and he's very firm. He says, Moses, tell them to break camp. In other words, get ready. Pack everything up that you've camped out here beside the Red Sea. Pack everything up and get ready so that whenever I tell you to go, you can go. So while they're packing up, you stretch out your staff over the water and part it so that they can go through on dry ground. Now, Moses had already been a part of God's supernatural acts with the judgments on the gods of Egypt. All the plagues, all the things that happened. So the staff is not unfamiliar. Moses had used it a few times in some of the miracles. So God's just telling him, stretch out your staff. Now the staff isn't anything miraculous. It's just a representation of the presence of God with the people. That's what the staff is all about. It's God is using this inanimate object for his purpose. God uses us for his purpose. He uses anything he desires because he's all powerful and he's able. And so God is going to use Moses and this staff, and he's telling the people to get ready to go. And so in the next few verses it says, as for me, I am going to harden the hearts, and this is God talking, of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh, all his army and his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So in this statement, God explained exactly what he was going to do for the general purpose, and he also stated the reason why he did it. What was that reason? What was that reason he was going to judge Pharaoh according to this passage? We know that they've sinned and he'd waited all these years before he judged them. But what was his purpose in these verses?
So that he would receive the glory.
Verse 18 says, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I receive glory through Pharaoh. How do you receive glory? Through killing people. Well, he's talking to the Israelites, understand. This is the Israelites' enemy. They've been oppressed for years. And so for them, that was victory. That was freedom from the oppression, freedom from slavery. And God says, I'll receive the glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So in other words, he's going to receive the credit. He's going to be the one responsible. He's going to be the one that they can look to and say, God did this, not the Israelite army did this. And so it's going to be obvious that God is the one who acted in this, not the people. They didn't do anything on their own to fix the problem. You understand that in our salvation, there's nothing we can do to receive it. In the victory God gives us over sin and death, it's not because we've accomplished something to get there. It's because God, in his grace, was willing to provide the forgiveness by doing something for us, just like he's doing something for the Israelite people here. He's providing protection and provision for them, for their salvation, for their immediate salvation. And so you understand that God's purposes included more than punishing Egypt. It was to reveal himself to the world, and ultimately to the people that were going to be following him into the promised land, into Canaan. In spite of that, though, as we look on in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, we see how Israel didn't really get the message very well, did they? But right now, God is demonstrating his power, demonstrating his faithfulness, and demonstrating his salvation to the people. In verse 19 he says, "Then the angel of God, who was going in front of the Israelite forces, moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. It came between the Egyptian and the Israelite forces. There was cloud and darkness. It lit up the night, and neither group came near the others all night long." So get the picture here. Moses stretches out his staff. All the people are packing everything up, getting ready to go. And the waters parted. And it says all night long this was going on. So God parted the waters, and all night he's drying up the seabed so that the people can pass through on dry ground. And so God is already telling the people, and he sends his angel. He uses anything he desires. It says he sends an angel of God is in the midst of the pillar of fire. Right? He's in the cloud and in the fire, and he's actually holding them off. And so even in this situation, to hold the army back until Israel's ready to go across, God was acting for their benefit. You know, sometimes when we're waiting to move, when we're waiting on God to move, we don't need to forget that he's still watching over us, still protecting, still providing, until the time comes that we're to move. You see, God is always at work in our lives. He's always at work in his purpose and fulfilling his purpose. And there's nothing that can change God's purpose. Our actions don't change it. We may have an opportunity to see God glorify himself through our obedience. But if we don't do it, God will use somebody else to fulfill his purpose, because his purpose is going to be fulfilled. And so, but it would be better that we were a part of that, wouldn't it? It'd be better if we were faithful. Now I want to ask you something real quick. In the midst of Israelite situation, what would your reaction be? Would you stand still and wait?
The Israelites was in a position they wasn't no running forward or running backwards.
Can you imagine in their shoes, standing there all night long, watching, looking across at the Egyptian army, thinking, any little movement, they're probably thinking, here they come. You know, I imagine they're awful nervous.
But people do some crazy things when they're up against the wall, like jumping in the ocean and trying to swim somewhere you can't.
What's amazing to me here is that the Egyptian army came at them, and it wasn't long. Pharaoh said, "Let them go." And it wasn't long. He said, "All right, gather the army and come back after them." Why did he do that? Because God hardened his heart. He changed his heart, obviously, to bring judgment on them. But in a human circumstance, it was fear of loss, wasn't it? It was fear that they were going to lose something that they had control over, that they had power over, they thought, right? That the Israelites were a workforce for them. They done everything for the Egyptians, building projects. They done anything that needed done. They were at their beck and call. And Pharaoh probably thought, "Oh no, what did I do?" And so he thought, you know what? The plague's over. We're going to go back and go get them. He made a mistake, because Pharaoh underestimated God. And the final judgment on the Egyptians wasn't the firstborn losing their lives. It was because of their poor decision after that and following the Israelites into the Red Sea. Let's look at the next few verses. There's quite a few verses we're going to read here. It says in verse 21, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided." Who did it? The Lord did, right? Drove back the Red Sea. So, it says in verse 22, "And the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground." You notice that. I don't know about you, but I don't care how long the wind blows, all night long, it's not going to be enough to dry a seabed that's been wet for, years, right? Unless God does it. Because God is over nature, isn't He? He's over all things. But it says, with the waters like a wall on to them on their right and on their left. And so picture this. You can kind of watch it in movies when they do it. They stand the waters up on both sides and the Israelite people march through. I don't know about you, but if I seen something like that, I would be in awe. I don't know if I'd be walking or be going, what in the world is going on? I mean, truthful. But I also know that they knew that the Egyptians were behind them, so they're thinking, I don't know what this is, but we're gone. You know, we're getting out of here. And so they took off. They started moving, and you got, this isn't like 100 people walking through. This is hundreds of thousands or thousands of people. Whatever the number is, it was a big number. And they're all passing through. And so it's going to take some time, isn't it? It's not going to be something that you snap your fingers and they're on the other side and it's done. It's a time-consuming thing. And it says in verse 23, the Egyptians set out in pursuit all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, and went into the sea after them. Now I want to stop for a second. If the sea had been parted, and even if the wind blew all night, what kind of crazy person's going to drive a chariot that's heavy with wheels on it trying to go through a riverbed? I don't know if you ever been in like a riverbed where it's sand. You can't even drive a vehicle through it most of the time. So you think about this. What kind of crazy thought did it take for someone to pursue these people into the middle of a riverbed or seabed, thinking that they're going to make it through with chariots? Well, the Bible already said that it's dry ground, so I guess they thought that'd be okay. But the only reason they did it is because their leader, who they thought would be a god one day, told them to do it and go. You see, the difference between the leadership of Egypt and the leadership of Israel is that the one who's in charge of Israel is all-knowing and all-powerful and able to overcome any challenge, whereas Pharaoh was very limited. They had had some great military success, but he thought, you know what, we're powerful enough, we can overtake these people. We're going to see in a minute that even the Egyptian army that went into the sea recognized a little too late that God was on their side. It says in verse 24, during the morning watch, the Lord looked down at the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud and threw the Egyptian forces into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with difficulty. And this is what the Egyptian army said, let's get away from Israel, the Egyptians said, because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. I want you to notice something, and if you just read through this, it's something that you don't really pay attention to. But you never hear them say Moses did this or the Israelites did this. They're saying God did this. Every time that it's mentioned here, it says the Lord threw them into confusion. It says let's get away from Israel, the Egyptians said, because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. In other words, they're saying Yahweh's doing this to us. We need to get away from them. That's the only way we're going to save ourselves, is stay away from these people. God's fighting for them. He's fighting their battle for them. We need to understand in our life, God is the one that fights our battles. That's why the Bible reminds us we're not to retaliate against people who do wrong to us. We're to trust God, who is the judge, right? We don't judge because people sin against us. We wait on God to be the judge, because His judgment is right and perfect and just, right? That's why God didn't have the Israelites fight the Egyptians. He said, get out of here, I'll take care of this. The Israelite people needed to know this because they're getting ready to go into the wilderness and have to trust God for their food, for everything, for everyday life. And they needed to understand that this God is powerful enough to do whatever needs to be done. And you think they would get the picture. But obviously we see later on, they're short-sighted, like we are. He says in verse 26, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back on the Egyptians, on their chariots and horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal depth. While the Egyptians were trying to escape from it, the Lord threw them into the sea. The water came back and covered the chariots and horsemen, plus the entire army of Pharaoh that had gone after them into the sea. Not even one of them survived. I put a little note here at the bottom of my page. It says, I wrote, God's judgment is complete. You see, when God is ready to judge, it's going to be a complete judgment. He's not going to miss something. It says here that not even one of them survived. Anybody that was going to fight against God and pursue God's people, who he was bound and determined to set free, is going to pay the penalty for their actions, and that's exactly what happened. Whether Pharaoh told them to go or not, they pursued them through the sea, and they died doing it. You see, God is going to overcome every enemy. We read in Corinthians at the end of 1 Corinthians, he's already overcome death through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, our greatest enemy, right? All of us are going to face that at one time. But I underline, not even one of them survived. God is faithful to his people, to his children. He'll take whatever means necessary to protect his people. And he showed that here. But he'll also take whatever means necessary for people to know that he is God. I don't know about you, but I've never seen a miracle like this myself, personally. I've read about it in Scripture. I've visualized it. I've seen it in movies, how they portray it, but I've never seen it myself. If you've seen an act of God like this, would it change your view of God? Would it cause you to be more faithful and more trusting toward him? Because that's the whole reason God did this, to glorify himself so that the people of Israel would know, and other nations as well, that he is God and that he's able, because he's all powerful. And nothing can stand against him, and nothing will stand against him, because his purposes will be completed.
I'm afraid that if something like that did happen, there would be a logical explanation from the authorities.
Yeah.
It would explain what happened. There's something like that happened in the first Gulf War,
Mm-hmm.
when they thought Saddam Hussein had gas weaponry. And the story, as the story went, the air or wind changed directions and wouldn't allow him to use his chemical warfare weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of kept under wraps. It wasn't publicized a lot and all that.
Yeah.
Some of the guys that was over there testified to it.
Well, I mean, the reality is there is no such thing as Mother Nature. God is the God of nature. And so if the wind would happen to change directions, the only person that can control that's God himself. So it has to be God. And we live in a culture that wants to belittle God and take away his power and take away the praise that he's deserving. And Satan's been working on that for years. That's the whole point, to blind people to the truth of what God's really doing and what he's done. And so that's not uncommon for that to happen. But I want to ask you about Christians. And this is something that I've talked about before, maybe not with you, but with other people. Every time that there's a miracle that God ordains to happen, whether it be the New Testament or Old Testament, no matter what it is, who's the one that performs the miracle? God is, right? Because he steps outside of the natural world and does something supernatural that no one else can do. And no one can manufacture. Because God is the only one that can do that. He's the one that is powerful enough to. But my question is, whenever you see so-called Christians doing miracles, and they're patting themselves on the back because they can do this miracle or that, don't you think that's a gross misrepresentation of God? Because God didn't say, hey, Moses, go out there and raise your staff and say, hey, look at me. Did he? He didn't tell Jesus to go heal the blind man so that they can come pat him on the back. As a matter of fact, there's times that Jesus healed someone and took off before they even know anything about who he was. And later on, they had another interaction. Anytime that Paul or any of the other apostles did miracles, it wasn't for them. If you remember, it was always to point to Jesus. Well, why are you surprised at this? This Jesus who raised from the dead is the one who did this. That's what the apostles would say. So anytime you hear someone glorifying themselves for miracles that they can do, they're misrepresenting God. And more than likely, it's false anyway. Because God doesn't reward faith just so that you can do miracles to point to yourself. The only reason that miracles occur is so that God can be seen in any circumstance. So that any time a miracle happens, people need to be saying, look what God has done. We do face this challenge today. If you notice in the book of Acts, you had a magician who wanted to be converted and wanted the power to do certain things. And what did Peter say to him? You have no part with us. Because your mind is all wrong. You're focused on you having the power, not glorifying God. Because that's the only reason any miracle's ever done. That's the only reason God did this, was to bring attention to himself and to save his people whom he loved. You see, if God's going to do a miracle in your midst, it's so that you can find more confidence in him. So that he can identify himself in your circumstance, in your situation. And so that you can point others to what he's able to do for them. You see, that's what God's miracles are all about. We need to understand that God is able to deal with any circumstance and struggle we may have. But sometimes we just need to stand still and wait on him to move. Other times we need to listen and be obedient to whatever it is he says to do. But most of all, we just need to have faith to trust him in whatever thing we're dealing with. And that's what this is all about. This whole lesson is the reality that God's all powerful. He's a God of love and of mercy, but he's also a God who will judge sin. And he's going to judge his enemies one day. But through Jesus Christ, he's already given us victory. He brought salvation to the Israelite people as they went through the Red Sea. As they passed through the danger, they made it through on the other side safe. And as I face sin, and as you face sin in your life and had no way to fix the problem, you stood at a crossroads at one time in your life, at one day, when you recognized that Jesus was the only fix for your problem. And when you did that, God provided help and salvation. But you had to recognize your situation first and recognize that he was your only hope. The Israelites learned that lesson in this story. Whether they continued to remain faithful after that was another thing. But in this moment, they seen God act. And the Bible reminds us that even the Egyptians recognized that this was God. And unfortunately, many of them paid the price for it. Everyone that went into the Red Sea after the Israelites did pay the price for it. But there were still some left behind. As far as I know, Pharaoh was still alive. He didn't go through in the sea. But I'll bet there was a whole lot less followers of him after that. I'm sure next time that he's told them militarily to go do something, they questioned, didn't they? And I'm sure they didn't think, well, he's not a God anymore. Either that or he's a weak one that couldn't overcome Yahweh. So no matter what situation you're facing today, no matter how big or insurmountable the issue may be, trust him. He'll see you through. I imagine people in Florida and Texas right now are having a hard time standing still and seeing how God's going to heal their problems. But he's able. Is he not? You want to have any comments or any questions before we close?
I'm amazed at God how He takes care of little details. Like in 14 there, where He was talking to Moses and told him where to go and camp at, and then He said, "For Pharaoh will say to the children of Israel, they're entangled in the land," and that the little details He takes care of for His glory, and it just amazes me.
Yeah, see, God is all-knowing, not only all-powerful. He's outside of time. In other words, He knows what's going to happen 10 years from now, just like it's already happened. But we don't know what's going to happen in the next minute sometimes in our life. But you see, that's what we need to understand about God. He's bigger than we can even fathom. And when we try to bottle Him up into something we can grasp, we've boxed Him in. And not really boxed Him in because God can't be controlled and boxed in, but in our own mind, we've limited God to this small thing. And the Egyptians needed to understand, and so did the Israelites, that God can't be contained. And we as Christians need to understand that no matter how bad it is in our life or how bad our circumstance is, God is big enough to fix the problem and contain the problem. And His purpose in that situation, in that struggle, is going to be fulfilled whether it's what we want or not. God is the one that's going to work it out for His purpose and His reasoning. Are we always going to understand it? No, we're not. Because we don't have the mind of God. But we can trust Him that whatever He does is what's best. Maybe not for us, but for the person who's witnessing us. There may be a lost person seeing us go through this, and they may find strength in that to come to know this God. Because no matter what we face, no matter what God's people go through, we're to be a light to the world around us. And that light is supposed to shine in the light of Jesus Christ and the power of God in that. And that's the whole purpose, even in this lesson, that others may know that He is God. So, as we face our challenges in our life, remember that others are watching, and that God will either be glorified in our decision making, or He'll be belittled. I don't know about you, I hope He's glorified in the decisions I make and the struggles of my life.